Hi. Can you hear me? Cool. So my name is Loree Whelan, and I'm an American Studies major here at Smith, focusing on art since 1960. I'm graduating this spring, and I was speaking with my grandmother, who's a Smith College class of 1958, about returning to her alma mater for my commencement. And she was reminiscing about her days in Haven House, leaving pizza on the radiator overnight to keep it warm, and participating in all sorts of house rivalry-related debauchery, when it dawned on her that one of her old housemates might be of some interest to me. Lucy Lippard, she said, taught her to ice skate one chilly winter and was now a renowned figure in the art world. Apparently, Miss Lippard was affectionately referred to as Flip, a nickname she picked upon coming to Smith because, as she told me yesterday over lunch, she'd just never had a nickname before. I gasped, of course, upon hearing about my grandmother's connection, and began to explain to her how formative Miss Lippard's work has been for me in my studies. And so it's a particularly great honor for me to be introducing Lucy Lippard to you today. Miss Lippard considers herself first and foremost a writer. After graduating with a bachelor's from Smith in 1958 and a master's from NYU in 1962, she began her career in the art world, writing for a wide range of publications such as Art International, Art in America, and The Village Voice. The recipient of a 1968 Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as many other awards for her writings on art, she has published 20 books on a broad range of themes, from feminist art practice to social activism, politics, and place. In 1969, she helped to found the Art Workers Coalition, a group dedicated to effecting change within the art institution. She's just finished her 21st book about archaeology in her home state of New Mexico. I first encountered Miss Lippard's work in a class on modernism and the neo-avant-gardes. We read her highly influential 1971 essay, The Dematerialization of Art, in which she synthesized what had earlier seemed like the disparate and dissonant practices of conceptual art of the day through a consideration of how artists of the period were, as she put it, losing interest in the physical evolution of the work of art. I've always admired Miss Lippard's frankness and ability to articulate themes in a nuanced but forceful manner. So what about now? Can we talk about the role of the artist with the same kind of language in this contemporary moment? What does it mean to be an artist currently? What kind of work is to be done? Frankly, Miss Lippard wrote in a 2008 response to a questionnaire in the art journal October, I think it's a liberal idea that artists are real people too. I don't think we are. We're coming from another angle, which makes it all the more imperative to know not only who our audiences are, but how they see, how they think. I greatly look forward to hearing Miss Lippard share her reflections with us today on women in art. In the past, she has grappled with questions such as, what is the political effectiveness of art? And how do women artists contend with this, particularly when they are working, as she said in 1971, 3 jobs instead of 2? Their art, work for pay, and the traditional unpaid work that's never done. Has the situation changed, I wonder? Is the artist still to be a social activist? It's my pleasure to introduce to you today the renowned writer, activist, curator, and, as it turns out, talented ice skating coach, Lucy Lippard.
Her grandmother's name was Coco Stork, for those of you who remember. Could this light go out? It's right in my face. Is there a light?
Take a little experiment.
Is there a light?
Is that it?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. Now I can see the audience. You are out there. Thanks for staying. Well, this, as you can see from the slides, not PowerPoint, is going to be an old-fashioned lecture. If you're not institutionalized, as I've never been, you can't really afford to have all your slides digitized. So I'm creeping toward PowerPoint when somebody says they'll do it for me, but otherwise that's about it. And the work I'll show is mostly older because people don't send me slides anymore, so it's all complicated. But that's not all bad because some of it may be unfamiliar to the younger women here. Anyway, I hope we have time for discussion, which is my favorite part of doing talks, so I'll race through this. It's fun to be back at Smith. When I was here, I was an art history major, mostly, I admit, so I could go to Paris for my junior year. Following in my mother's footsteps, it had changed her life, and I was ready for a change in mine. I'd won the Mary Augusta Jordan Prize for Creative Writing, which turned out not to be a prize, it was a little flat thing. I'd hoped it was money, but it wasn't. And I knew I wanted to be a writer, not of art books then, but the great American novel, which I turned out to be not very good at. I got to New York in the fall of 1958 after a stint in a tiny Mexican village with the American Friends Service Committee, a forerunner of the Peace Corps, and was immensely lucky to land in the library at the Museum of Modern Art, which wasn't at all the glamorous art gallery job I thought I'd get, which would have been disastrous for me. By then, I knew that I was much more interested in art that was making history than in history already made. By the late 60s, I'd fallen victim to the radical whirlwind, as the right-wing critic Hilton Kramer once said, which was not meant as a compliment. The anti-Vietnam War movement and conceptual art, then feminism and women's art, were the transformative experiences that makes me what I am today, a ranting old lady and proud of it. This is pretty obvious. That's some kind of 19th century women painters, and the one on the right is WAC, Women's Action Coalition, in the early 90s. Make sure I have these things right now. So I'm not really going to talk about the real life of any generic woman artist, and especially in the 21st century, since I've been out of the art world as such for 17 years now, but about feminist artists for whom social change is an integral part of life and art, whose work is entwined with the social structures it criticizes and analyzes. I've been a feminist for 40 years now, and it affects everything I do. My own taste leans toward art that comes to grips with life, and sometimes intervenes in life. Feminists, by definition, engage with the world, and in the process, they've brought their feminism to a very wide variety of issues. You've heard from Meryl and Susan, two definite examples of that. Suzanne Lacey's powerful large-scale performances, which you see here, claim not only public space but public consideration. This piece was devoted to a dialogue. Oh, no, this piece was actually not devoted to a dialogue between cops. I changed it. It's incarcerated women and violence against women. It's called Auto on the Edge of Time and Auto Doing Time. It was a connected thing. They decorated these cars with things that, and as somebody mentioned yesterday, a lot of these women were in prison because they had fought back. Meryl Calise and Susan Hillier, as I said, you heard from yesterday. Meryl on the left and Susan on the right, they spoke for themselves. Meryl has constantly expanded her originally domestic maintenance art into the urban infrastructure, and Susan takes on the most complex issues in a disturbing and intellectually layered manner. This is from Monument, which she showed at the beginning last night. Harmony Hammond on the left makes eloquent minimal abstractions in which paint quality stands in for the queer body. And Louise Bourgeois, who is now in her 90s, does the same for the female body. This is an old piece that was in a show I did in 1966 called Eccentric Abstraction. Ida Applebrug comments on obliquely and with great humor on the sort of the human condition, and especially the female human condition. And on the right, Cathy Vargas from My Alamo. She lives in San Antonio, and she was talking about how that Alamo was not her Alamo as a Chicana. Feminist artists are concerned with the global class struggle, with racism, peace, environmental justice, and so on and so forth. The many women actively opposing the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, Women in Black, Artists Against the War, Not in Our Name, and so forth, were acting as feminists when they insisted after 9/11, our grief is not a cry for war. That's them on the left, and on the right is Nancy Spiro, her Male Bomb series from 1966 or so. Years ago, a friend asked me a leading question: is the role art plays as an agent of change more important to you than the other roles it can play? And I realized it was, to me personally, though that's not a general value judgment. I still like to look at other art, but this is my focus. Since a brief formalist period of art criticism in the early 60s, I've been far more interested in the contradictory, mysterious ways in which artists and objects or actions enter society, in what images mean and do to people, and how contact and lack of contact with the audiences or communities affect what artists do in the studio. I'm particularly fond of art's potential to open people's eyes, to make them see, think, and act. But I also realize that all the other roles artists can play are also part of social change. We tend to forget that in the heat of organizing politically with culture, which is what I've spent a chunk of my life doing. In very different ways, artists frame what people see, and that's a big responsibility. This is two different ways of framing. On the left is Eva Hesse's hang-up from the late 60s, and on the right, Loree OGrady's art is ... a huge gold frame that went through Harlem on a parade, and with her friends and artist friends with frames, and they would jump off and frame the audience. And it was, the point of this was that Harlem is also a place for art, and the people there are also audiences for art. That's Lorraine at the left there. Having politics and making art is not an either-or proposition. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but some of the art being made every day in the world's studios and public spaces has to offer a critique of the society it rides on and through. Our art is defined by our political positions, whether or not we think we even have any, and the choices have to be conscious and honest ones. Culture always reinforces the status quo, or it resists it. When we get down to naming the cause of our anger or anxiety, we run up against the fact that we're working in an art world that often considers any intelligible content, not to mention opinions, as dread propaganda. In the US, we've been educated to think art is powerless, either above it all or below it all, somewhere out there in the ether where nobody has to worry about it. And yet visual images from the mass media manipulate our most fundamental beliefs. But the people who make those images, their names are not known. And that's the fundamental difference between an artist and somebody else who's a visual person whose name is not known. And I sometimes question the need for artists to have their names known, because they could maybe be much more effective if the names weren't known. But that's another whole story. The economically enforced confinement of high art in the art world, where it can be controlled by a single class and by the market, is one of the ways fine artists are kept from effectively addressing a broader audience. While activist artists rejecting that confinement move across the artificial barricades that separate high art and low art, fine and popular culture, an organized relationship to society is still lacking. These sort of... That's a very old joke, and somebody told me they just got it on a coffee mug someplace. And the one on the right is by Clarissa Sly. I don't know who did the one at the left, so if anybody does, let me know. The one on the right is by Clarissa Sly, an African-American artist who was working with the sort of Dick and Jane. It's called Reading Dick and Jane with Me. If we're going to reveal that ugly truth beneath the pretty lies, we have to be sure we do so in a way that's empowering or funny and not just dispiriting. One of the feminist artists' jobs is to give voice to those dissatisfactions and to the woman whose experience doesn't jibe with the American dream. And part of any artist's responsibility is to collaborate with her audience. The aesthetic image can and should be subversive on some often very subtle level. I don't know how often I've been asked when showing activist images why everything is so angry, why there isn't more beauty. And as far as I'm concerned, some so-called negative images, while not pleasant, function positively by interrupting the flow of illusion or delusion, and they can convey a terrible beauty.